You've probably been told that if a woman isn't interested, you should just give up, move on, or try harder to prove yourself. But here's the uncomfortable truth most men never really understand. Women don't miss men because they need them. They miss men because those men know how to create a powerful emotional presence, even in their absence. Before you dismiss this, think about your own experiences for a moment. Think about someone you couldn't stop thinking about, even when they weren't doing anything dramatic. It wasn't always the loudest or most available person who stayed in your mind. It was the one who left a feeling behind. That feeling is what we are really talking about today. And if you are watching this right now, there is a good chance you have already felt what it is like to give too much, chase too hard, or wonder why your effort wasn't returned the way you expected. Stay with me, because what you are about to understand will completely change how you approach attraction, attention, and emotional connection. Mary Smith, host of Senior Mindful Living YouTube channel. Most people misunderstand attraction as something you earn through effort alone. They believe if they just do more, text more, explain more, or prove themselves more, they will eventually be valued. But human psychology doesn't work that way. Attraction is not created by abundance. It is created by emotional contrast, presence and absence, certainty and curiosity, familiarity and mystery. And this is where most men unknowingly lose their power. They become too available, too predictable, and too emotionally accessible too early. It feels like kindness, it feels like care, but psychologically, it removes the very tension that creates desire. Let me ask you something simple, but important. Have you ever noticed how someone starts to think about you more when you're not constantly around? When your messages slow down? When your attention shifts? Or when your energy is not fully centered on them? That shift is not random. It is the mind reacting to absence. Because the human brain does not miss what is always available. It only misses what becomes emotionally significant through contrast. Now, here is where everything begins to shift. Making a woman think about you and eventually miss you is not about games or manipulation. It is about understanding how emotional memory works. The mind remembers feelings, not constant access. If you become a source of constant access with no emotional depth, you become background noise. And background noise is easily ignored. But when your presence creates emotional impact and your absence creates curiosity, something very different happens. You become mentally active in her mind even when you are not physically present. And this is the foundation most men never learn. Now, before we go deeper, I want to connect this to something real. Imagine a woman who initially seems uninterested or emotionally distant. Most men respond in one of two ways. They either try harder, sending more messages, explaining more, hoping something will change. Or they withdraw completely out of frustration, without understanding timing or emotional rhythm. But there is a third approach that most people overlook: emotional positioning. This is not about chasing or disappearing. It is about becoming someone who is not emotionally overexposed, someone whose presence feels valuable because it is not overwhelming. And here's the truth that will challenge your assumptions. Women are not attracted to men who are always trying to be understood. They are drawn to men who are naturally not fully figured out, not because of secrecy, but because of depth, independence, and emotional self-control. Now, think about your own behavior for a moment. When you are constantly available, constantly explaining yourself, constantly checking in, what does that communicate? It communicates emotional dependency. Even if your intentions are good, the message received is different. It signals that your emotional state is tied to their response. And nothing reduces attraction faster than that. Because attraction is not just about comfort, it is also about perception of value, and value is shaped by emotional scarcity, not emotional excess. Let's slow this down and make it practical. One of the biggest attraction mistakes men make is chasing emotional certainty too early. They want to know where they stand, how she feels, and what is going to happen. But in doing so, they remove all space for curiosity. And curiosity is the root of emotional attachment. Think about it like this. If someone is always available, always responsive, always predictable, your brain stops scanning for them. There is no emotional gap to fill. But if someone is occasionally present, emotionally balanced, and not overly accessible, your mind starts to wonder. And that wondering becomes emotional investment. This is not about ignoring someone. It is about not overfeeding attention to the point where it loses meaning. Now let's go into something deeper. Most men think attraction is built through effort, But in reality, attraction is often built through interpretation. How she interprets your behavior matters more than what you are actually doing. Two men can say the same words. One creates interest, the other creates indifference. The difference is not the words, it is the emotional energy behind them. And this is why chasing always backfires. Because chasing changes how you are perceived. It shifts you from being a man of value to a man seeking validation. And validation-seeking behavior is always felt, even if it is not explicitly seen. Now, I want you to imagine a simple scenario. You are texting someone you like. At first, they respond normally. Then over time, you start texting more, initiating more, filling silence faster than they do. What happens psychologically? The balance shifts. You become the source of emotional effort, while they become the receiver. And the human mind always values what is not freely given. So when you step back even slightly, something interesting happens. The dynamic resets. Not because of manipulation, but because of contrast. Your absence creates space, and that space creates thought, and thought creates emotional presence. This is where most men misunderstand silence. Silence is not about playing games. It is about allowing emotional space to exist. If you are constantly filling that space with words, you are not giving the other person room to think, feel, or miss anything. Silence has weight because it forces reflection, and reflection is where emotional attachment begins. But there is an important distinction here. This is not about disappearing or punishing someone with distance. That approach never creates healthy attraction. Instead, it is about maintaining your own emotional center. A man who is grounded in his own life does not need constant reassurance through conversation. He communicates, then he lives. And that alone changes everything. Because now, instead of being a man who reacts to silence, you become a man who is comfortable within it. And comfort within silence is one of the strongest psychological signals of confidence. And confidence, real confidence, is not loud. It is not forced. It is not about dominance. It is about emotional independence. When a woman senses that your life continues, whether she is actively engaging you or not, she begins to perceive you differently. Not because she is losing you, but because she realizes you are not emotionally dependent on her presence. And that is where interest begins to deepen. But here is where things get even more interesting. Most men think they need to constantly maintain attention. In reality, attention is not something you constantly maintain. It is something you strategically allow space for. If everything is always available, nothing feels significant. But when something is experienced in rhythm, with presence and space, it becomes memorable. And memory is the foundation of missing someone. So as we continue, you will start to see a pattern forming. It is not about doing more. It is about doing less in the right places. Not less effort, but more emotional intelligence. Not less care, but more awareness of timing, space, and perception. Because at the end of the day, attraction is not built in constant contact. It is built in emotional contrast. And once you understand that, you stop chasing approval and start building presence. Next, we will go deeper into how emotional availability, silence, and self-respect reshape how a woman perceives you, and why the strongest attraction is often created when you are not trying to force it at all. When you begin to understand attraction on a deeper level, something inside your behavior naturally starts to shift. You stop reacting emotionally to every small change in attention, and you start observing patterns instead. And this is where most men begin to realize something very important. Attraction is not built in intensity alone. It is built in emotional rhythm, consistency, and space. Because when there is no space, there is no reflection. And when there is no reflection, there is no emotional attachment forming underneath the surface. One of the most misunderstood principles in female psychology is emotional availability. Most men assume that being constantly emotionally available is what creates closeness. But in reality, over-availability often removes emotional tension, and without tension, attraction becomes flat. Think about real life for a moment. Have you ever met someone who is always there, always responding, always emotionally open from day one? At first, it may feel comforting, but over time, something subtle happens. The emotional edge disappears. There is no anticipation, no curiosity, no sense of, I wonder what they are thinking right now. And without that curiosity, the mind stops investing. Mary Smith, host of Senior Mindful Living YouTube channel. Now here is where things become very interesting psychologically. The human brain is wired to value emotional investment that feels earned, not freely given. When something is too easy to access emotionally, the brain categorizes it as low priority. But when emotional access has rhythm, boundaries, and balance, it becomes more meaningful. This is why silence, when used correctly, is not absence. It is emotional structure. It allows the other person to process your presence in your absence, and that processing is where attachment begins. Let's bring this into a real scenario again. Imagine you have been consistently available to someone. You respond quickly, you initiate conversations, you keep things flowing. But over time, you notice their effort is not matching yours. Instead of increasing your effort, the more psychologically powerful move is to reset your emotional presence. Not by disappearing, but by stepping back into your own life. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing replies. You stop filling every gap of silence with messages. And what happens next is not immediate, but it is powerful. The dynamic begins to shift. Because now, your absence is no longer background noise. It becomes noticeable. And once something becomes noticeable, it becomes mentally processed. This is where curiosity begins to rise. And curiosity is one of the strongest emotional triggers in attraction psychology. When someone cannot fully predict your availability, your thoughts, or your next move, the brain starts to stay alert. It starts to think about you in moments where you are not even present. That is the beginning of emotional presence without physical presence. But let's be clear about something important. This is not about playing hard to get. It is about being hard to fully define. There is a difference. Hard to get is often performative. It is intentional distance used as a tactic. But hard to define comes from having a full life, emotional control, and not overexposing yourself too quickly. One is manipulation, the other is self-respect. And women respond very differently to both. Now let's talk about something most men never consider: predictability. Predictability is often mistaken for safety, but in attraction, too much predictability removes emotional tension. When someone knows exactly how you will react, how quickly you will respond, and how emotionally available you will be, there is no psychological uncertainty left. And without uncertainty, there is no emotional pull. Think of it like a story. If you already know the ending, you stop reading. Not because the story is bad, but because there is no suspense. Human connection works the same way. We stay emotionally engaged when we are slightly uncertain about what comes next. So when you introduce controlled unpredictability into your presence, not through chaos, but through balance, you naturally increase emotional engagement. You don't respond instantly every time. You don't always explain everything immediately. You don't always make yourself emotionally available at the exact moment someone expects it. Instead, you maintain your own rhythm. And that rhythm creates curiosity. Now let's address something directly. Many men fear that stepping back will make them lose a woman's interest completely. But here's the truth that most people avoid. If interest disappears the moment you stop overgiving, then what was there was not real attraction. It was dependency on attention. Real attraction does not collapse from absence. It grows through reflection. Let that sit for a moment, because what actually happens when you step back correctly is not rejection. It is re-evaluation. She starts to think differently. She starts to notice what she felt but didn't fully process. She starts to recognize your emotional footprint. An emotional footprint is what remains when physical interaction is reduced. Now, let's go deeper into behavior patterns. One of the most powerful signals of attraction is not what you say, but what you are willing to walk away from. A man who constantly adjusts himself to keep someone's attention is communicating low self-priority. But a man who maintains his own standards, even in silence, communicates stability. And stability is deeply attractive on a psychological level, because stability suggests emotional safety without dependency. Now here is something subtle but very important. Women do not only respond to presence, they respond to consistency of self-respect. If your behavior changes drastically based on how someone treats you, that signals emotional instability. But if your behavior remains grounded regardless of external validation, that signals strength. And strength creates respect before it creates attraction. And respect is often the foundation of long-term emotional desire. Let's talk about another psychological trigger: loss perception. People value things more when they feel they might lose them. This is not manipulation. This is basic human cognition. When something feels guaranteed, it loses urgency. When something feels like it could shift or change, attention increases. But here's the key. This only works when your presence already has value. If there is no emotional value, distance does not create attraction. It creates indifference. That is why self-development, confidence, and emotional grounding matter so much. Because absence only amplifies what already exists. If your presence is strong, your absence becomes powerful. If your presence is weak, your absence becomes irrelevant. Now, let's bring this into real-life behavior again. Imagine a situation where you normally reply instantly, initiate conversations often, and stay consistently available. Then suddenly, you change your pattern. Not drastically, but naturally. You become more focused on your own life. You respond when you are available, not out of habit. You stop over-investing emotionally in early-stage interaction. What happens? At first, there may be silence, but then something shifts. You become more noticeable in your absence than you were in constant presence. And that is when emotional recalibration begins. She starts to reevaluate your value, not based on constant access, but based on emotional contrast. And contrast creates memory. Now let's talk about the deeper layer of this entire topic. The goal is not to make someone chase you. The goal is to become someone whose presence feels meaningful and whose absence feels noticeable. That is emotional maturity, not emotional manipulation. Because the truth is, real attraction does not come from pressure. It comes from perception. How she perceives your value, your independence, and your emotional control determines how she feels in your absence. And if there is one principle to take from all of this, it is this. You do not make someone miss you by trying harder. You make them miss you by becoming someone whose presence is not emotionally overexposed and whose absence creates space for thought. Because missing someone does not start in action, it starts in the mind. And once you understand that, you stop chasing attention and you start building emotional presence that lasts even when you are not there.